Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. My name is Caroline Stivers, and I'm Associate Director of Operations for Kentucky Commercialization Ventures, and will be hosting us today. The Kentucky Intellectual Property Alliance, or KIPA, is a program of the Kentucky Commercialization Ventures Initiative and KSTC. The mission of KIPA is to foster an effective ecosystem and marketplace to facilitate the creation, protection, and advancement of intellectual property in Kentucky by serving as a connecting organization for statewide companies, organizations, and innovators. So if you're not already familiar with us, you can find out more on KYIPA.org. Also wanted to give a big thanks to all of our executive advisory committee that are on today, who've provided incredible guidance and support since KIPA's formation. So a big thank you to them. I'm going to get us started with just a few Zoom items. First, today's webinar is being recorded. I'll be emailing a link out to our registrants and then also to our members afterwards. Second, we do have captions available. Those can be turned on or off at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll also have the transcription of the webinar available after we wrap up if it's needed. You can just send me an email if you'd like a copy of that. And then lastly, as we are hosting in the webinar format, participants are all muted. So you can place any questions or comments in the chat or Q&A area, or you can raise your hand and we can provide the option to be unmuted and promote you over here to talk. So if questions have not been addressed by the end of the presentation, we'll make sure to answer them before we end our webinar today, or we'll connect with you afterwards. So today, I have the great pleasure of introducing Mike Kasdan. Mike is founder and chief enthusiasm officer of Lawyering While Human. Mike's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and received his JD from NYU School of Law, where he now teaches as an adjunct professor. He's worked in law firms large, mid-sized, and small, practicing IP litigation for over 20 years. Mike is presently a partner in the IP group at Wigan and Dana LLP in their New York office and has served on their diversity and pro bono committees. For the last 10 years, Mike has also been in leadership at the Good Men Project, where he has served numerous roles on both the editorial and business sides, including editing and running its mental health section, and now serves as Director of Special Projects and Senior Sports Editor. He has written articles, appeared on TV, radio, and podcasts, developed videos and social media campaigns, hashtag Not Weak Just Human and hashtag We Rage for Love, and created and led training and workshop groups focused on mental health for over a decade. So, Mike, we are so happy to have you with us here today, and I will hand it over to you to get started.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'm really excited to do this for the Kentucky IP Alliance and to see some familiar faces and meet some new folks. But you know, let me share my slides first, and then I can get started with a little background. Thank you for that. What I now realize is entirely too long introduction. It always sounds so long when someone else is reading it, so I apologize for that. Can folks see that okay?
We are seeing the presenter mode right now.
All right, that's because I have two screens. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Let me see if I can fix that by sliding over here. Is that any better or not?
Yep, we can see
Okay.
that.
Excellent. So yes, my name is Mike Kasdan. It's also not in the too long bio, but I was also I've been involved in the IP alliances. I was the founder and original head of the New York IP Alliance a couple years back, and I see some people out there from KYIPA, and so it's nice to be presenting on kind of the two topics that matter. I won't say most, but a lot to me, that being IP folks thinking about innovation and commercialization, but also on this topic of mental health and well-being. I started this little project called Lawyering While Human a little over a year ago, so like in January of 22. But I've been thinking and talking more quietly and more anonymously and less in the at work and in the legal field about mental health for like 10, 12 years now. And for the past couple of years, I've been doing it, in our field, right? So two lawyers, two people doing IP commercialization, and otherwise. And what's really, I think, important is I've come to the realization that this, and I think the world and many other people, I'm not alone in this realization, is coming to this realization that, going to like the mental health thing and checking the box, isn't really what it's all about. That really, this issue kind of cuts through everything we do organizationally, right? Whether you're at a law firm or a licensing organization or, whatever your job is. This is one of those issues that's critical to doing the job well, but it's also an issue that we're not really used to talking about. There's a ton of stigma attached to it, and I think it's one where we kind of have a long way to go organizationally. But I see this as like an institutional and leadership issue that aligns like 120% with doing our jobs well, and so I feel like I didn't talk about this for almost my entire life. I'll sort of get into it, but I think from 0 to 35 years old, I didn't really think or talk about mental health at all. I didn't think depression was a thing. I guess that was a privilege and a blessing, but I think now I'm kind of making up for lost time. So from surviving to thriving is kind of the topic, and kind of we're going to cover a bunch of different things. I know, we have a small group of people have questions and want to throw them in the chat. That's great. I'll also try and use the chat for some interactivity, although it's of course not mandatory to participate, but it'd be great. So before we get started, and this is one of those times, and we're not used to talking about our mental health. I wasn't even until recently used to kind of thinking about my mental health. And when I say mental health, I don't necessarily mean like having a clinical something, but also just kind of navigating the everyday of life. For example, past 2 weeks has been really difficult for me, I'll say, because my dad was sick and in the hospital, and I'm coming to work and trying to do all the work and keep that isolated. But the fact of the matter is, that's got the attention of a lot of my brain and a lot of my heart. And that's, been a struggle. And I think every day, just being in the world as human beings. And I think part of this is kind of the silver lining of the pandemic. We had a little bit more of a window into that, going through kind of this collective trauma together, and also in this weird hybrid work world where we're seeing more people in our homes, and it's harder to keep that like work life, false separation or dichotomy. So, it's not something we're used to thinking about, but, if I were just to ask you today, like, how would you describe your mental condition? Like, how are you doing? And I'm not asking you to share your deepest, darkest secrets, but, how's it going today? Is it, and I think the fact of the matter is, every day is different, right? It's like not the same river, not the same man or woman, right? Every day we're navigating different stuff. Like, life is dynamic, and sometimes I think we feel like we're world beaters, and sometimes it's harder. So if you want to throw anything in the chat, that's great. Thank you, Megan. For me, I shared a little bit. If you don't, we can just keep talking. But the point is, there are good days and bad days. It depends, right? Some clinical thing, the usual, like, I'm busy, I'm good, I'm fine. Why do you ask? It could be any one of those things. But, the point of the exercise is that, every single human being has, we're dealing with mental health challenges. And it happens to be Mental Health Awareness Month again, even though this little image is from a year ago. So look at that. But I want to start today just by sharing a little bit of my personal story, including like how and I think why, it got there for me, how I dealt with it. And it includes, taking a leave of absence from my job in 2021, returning in 2022, and starting lawyering while human, and also, starting, I think, to really actually have a lot of fun doing the lawyering and IP part. So I want to acknowledge, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, we are speaking about this unspoken thing that people aren't great talking about. I teach at NYU, um, as an adjunct, and I had the opportunity to speak to that next gen a lot about this issue. Millennials, Gen Z, much more, comfortable talking about these issues, prioritizing these issues than I ever was, in my generation. And what was interesting to me in talking about it, back with NYU, one of the pieces of feedback I got was, like, yeah, all our students are ready to have these conversations, and that's it's true to an extent. But the other thing was like, but wow, like our professors are like, oh my God, what if I say the wrong thing? Like, how do I'm used to teaching patent law or constitutional law or how to do licensing. But to do this at work, it takes some training, it takes some thinking about, and it's not an easy thing to do. So I think that's true kind of in all of our organizations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit later in the presentation. But in terms of me, like how I got here, as I mentioned, the year 2021 was a rough one for me. It was, part of like quarantine, family stuff, parenting to teenager stuff, being isolated, and having that happen at the same time as work stressors. I feel like maybe I could have dealt with one or the other, but at the same time, was really hard for me. And I think, in stopping and pausing and taking a look around, one of the learnings was, our chosen field, the law. And I know not everyone who works in licensing or tech transactions, is a lawyer or works for a law firm. But this field is one of the worst in terms of, it's like high on the list that folks don't want to be on, in terms of burnout and depression and anxiety, and substance abuse, which is connected oftentimes to those things, because it's one of those negative coping mechanisms. And there are lots of theories as to why. But for me, I wrote about this for the first time in 2013, and I did it anonymously, just as a way of sort of processing stuff. And the first time I ever experienced depression was when I was 35 years old. And I think, and I literally can't remember even saying the word or even thinking about mental health before that point in time. So, as you might imagine, when I got very acute depression as a young partner in a law firm, with stuff going on in my personal life that was stressful, like navigating what would become a divorce, and also, just like having a new job, which was being partner, and having additional responsibilities, and like now you have to collect money, and now you have to talk to clients, and now there's this thing called accounts receivable, and you have to know what it is and how to collect it. There's lots, those two things happening at the same time, for me, put me on tilt in a way I hadn't experienced. And I got to the point where I suffered from quite acute depression. Waking up at 4 a.m, didn't want to work, didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to see people, and I'm a pretty social person. And my brain is usually pretty frenetic, and this was kind of the opposite. Like, things just came down to a halt. Like, I would go to work and go into my office and close the door and be confronted with daily life, like, hey, here's this email, you can respond this way or that way, and both ways seemed bad and scary. And so I didn't respond, right? And then the next day it piles on higher, the next day it piles on higher. And there's not so long that you can really do that, and really sort of function. And so I was very lucky. I had incredible family support. My younger sister, like basically ignored all my worst instincts, which were, I'll just power through. It's just work stress. I'll be fine. All of which was what came naturally, and all of which was totally wrong. And she basically came to my office and physically like got me to see a therapist for the first time in my life. And I still see a therapist because even when I'm feeling good, it's helpful to process stuff. And when I got right, I wrote this piece that's on the slides, and I apologize for all the words. I just sort of threw the article back there, but I wrote it for the Goodman Project. The prior article back in 2013, and I did it really to process it, and I was terrified to share it. I didn't even think about it, but one of my friends convinced me that I should publish it anonymously because nobody was really talking about it, and especially men weren't talking about it. And I did that. And I did it again in the legal fields with this American Lawyer piece in about a year ago. And just to explain, how I felt, how it felt, to try and sort of get over the stigma that this is weak and this is bad. And so I wrote this article just to kind of talk about this issue, and also just try to frame kind of a pathway forward. Because one thing that I learned over that 10 to 12 year period, where I did have depressions that recurred for short acute periods, and then we kind of power through that. So 2021 was one of those examples. I spent a lot of time feeling like, oh, like there's something wrong with me, and oh my God, what's happening? And two things that were learnings is, first of all, anytime I spoke about it with anyone and let someone in, had a really positive interaction. Because in terms of like authenticity, everyone's navigating something, and if it's not them themselves, it's their parent or their friend or their kid. And so you think that you're alone, but actually you're not. And my biggest kind of learning there, that actually also was really upsetting to me, is like 3 or 4, maybe 5 years after I first experienced depression in that really debilitating way. I had lunch with a couple old colleagues from my first law firm that I worked at. I was junior; they were kind of my mentors, and I remember going to a diner, and I said, "You know what? I'm going to like talk about this." And I said, 3 or 4 years ago, I had this thing that happened to me where I like couldn't function. Like it was super debilitating. And I explained what it felt like and what it was. And neither one of them were surprised. And both of them were like, oh yeah, that's depression. Like that's happened to me, 4 or 5 times in my career. And my thought was like, well, wow, that would have been really useful to know and talk about, and not to have felt so alone. So that's just a little bit of perspective of why I'm here talking about this stuff. And I think, again, like, the statistics and slides focus on the law. I know that, in this space, we're not, it's not everyone is a lawyer. But, the numbers in general, in the country and in the world, are not good. The numbers in the legal field are very bad. And I have these numbers from back in 2016 only to show that this wasn't some new thing that happened like because of the pandemic. It's kind of like any point in time where you've asked people in the legal industry about this topic, the numbers are poor. And these are the numbers, kind of in the heart of the pandemic, with, of course, increased isolation and burnout, which is still kind of part of the numbers. And I've taken a deep dive into the statistics, but I've also worked with folks, through autumn, in looking at, similar statistics in other industries, including, the tech transfer industry, and to look at ways to kind of improve that. So I know this is a little bit lawyer centric, law firm centric in terms of statistics, but I think that sort of the message is that, in the overall, we are in a place where it's I don't think it's overstating it to say it's crisis levels. Like the New York Times did a feature this weekend on, mental health and well-being, that I've read some of the articles, and it's people, it's like young folks, right? If you look at the numbers, like they're pretty scary. And I think one takeaway from me, I'm a big culture person, and I think I spent a lot of time thinking and believing that culture was one of these kind of fuzzy things where, you know, I didn't really think about it as an important driver. But now I'm really of the belief that, culture and the culture of a place is really a differentiator. And that we as participants in our workplaces, and especially as leaders, have the ability to in large part to create a culture, and that creating a better culture around this stuff is really important. And it's also not just culture, right? It's also, I think we spent a lot of time talking about the problem, right? We all read the articles and we see the statistics, and it's bad, and it's a problem. But my fiance has this thing that I really like, where she's like, there's certain meetings about the problem, and then there are other meetings about the solution. And I think we need to start having more meetings about the solution. And one of the things that I realized when I was out on my medical leave during 2021 is, for example, like my firm has no infrastructure, or had no infrastructure in terms of mental health. There are certain things that we can do to operationalize culture, like to say, okay, like here's the way we're structured, here are policies, here are practices. Not many of them are not rocket science, but just to create a more supportive culture, in a place where people know, like, hey, if I'm having a hard time, I can get help, and that is possible, and that people actually will take advantage of it, which is a big issue. One of the things I have perspective on this issue is like the difference from, now I'm old, right? I'm a partner now, and I'm like in my high 40s. And my perspective about this as a young person was really different, and I think kind of useful to look back, because as a young person I was like, well, I'm not in control, like people give me work, I just do it. I have to work really hard to differentiate myself. If I have some personal thing going on, I'll just make it work. And I think that led, I did that when I was a younger lawyer, and it led to like really poor work-life balance, and it probably led to me kind of burning out and leaving jobs earlier than I otherwise would have. And when I think about it as a partner now, like if I have someone who's smart and good and I like working with them, I'd actually much rather them communicate to me, and I want to create a place where they can communicate to me. Like when I give them a piece of work and they say, when do you want it? And I say, I want it, today. And they say, and I want them to be able to say, oh, it's actually my kid's birthday today. Are you going to look at it today? Like, can I get it to you tomorrow? Rather than them not doing that, missing their kid's birthday, being angry at me, burning out and leaving, or not communicating and sitting and stewing. And it's not even all about mental health. Some of it's just about communication. Like if someone doesn't know how to do something, I want a culture and environment where they actually ask me, rather than for 3 days stress about it and say, oh my God, like I don't know how to do this, and then give me some work product that's not great, and that creates more stress on me because I still have to get it done. It's so much better just to have more communication around those things, and I just think that aligns with good business. But back to the stats, which are terrible. And we're not going to spend a lot more time on this because lots of presentations talk about how bad the statistics are. But a couple of salient things to pull away from this is, we have a huge issue with burnout right now, statistically super high. And I think the middle number on this slide, like, 40% say, I don't want to talk about this stuff because I think it impacts negatively on me. And I get that. Like even now, like sharing super openly, and having created the hashtag not weak, just human, and encourage people to share their stories, like I still think about it. And so, I think we're not yet at a place, but where open sharing, free of consequences, we're still at a place where it's very stigmatized. But I think in our organizations, it benefits us to create environments, where people can say like, "Hey, I've got this thing going on. Can someone else cover for me?" Or, "Hey," and I think that's much better. And our organizations are built for that, and it aligns with good business. The other issue I want to talk about is stress. This was a study that came out a few months ago about stress in the legal profession. I imagine that it's not particular to lawyers and law firms, but that was kind of the group that it looked at. But stress is like a huge risk factor for severe mental health problems, including, suicidality. And people see this and they might say, well, I mean, okay, well, stress, we can't eliminate stress, and that's true, we can't eliminate stress. But I think we can do a lot to help people manage stressful situations who we work with, rather than like creating more stress, which I've seen a lot in my career, in terms of workplace culture. If what I'm doing is adding to the stress level, then that's something that we can control. So the statistics are one thing. I joined Instagram mainly to watch my kids, but I have found it to be super interesting, in the IP and law space, because I think that memes are another way, I think, to frame the same thing. Because I think the statistics and this send the same message, and I think this also transmits cultural truths, right? Like, this is what people think about when they think about people working in the law, or sometimes in IP law. I particularly like the mouse with the, I mean, but in a funny, not funny way, right? The mouse with its hair standing on edge, where the friend's like, "I feel like your personality is perfect for the law," and it's saying like, "Bro, actually, it's a disorder." And I think there's a lot, whether it's in law firms or in corporations or organizations, there's a lot of kind of the middle, like, I'm totally spent right by the end of the week. And really what I'm elevating is, or what I'm expected to do as culture is, just work myself to the bone, and say like, I'm busy, and that's kind of a badge of honor, rather than having a more balanced way. And I think that, you know, I've come to really be a believer in like taking breaks, and that it's actually better for our brains and better for the work side of things. And I've come kind of full circle on that. But these, I think the memes are kind of illustrative. The bottom one, on the left, is something I just saw yesterday that just felt altogether true. Being a lawyer sounds like it's just getting paid to have anxiety for someone else. So I think there's a little bit of truth to that. But in terms of the cultural piece, I think like these transmit a lot of truth. Like, people say, "Oh, like, how are you doing? I'm busy." I read a book a few years ago, called like what was it called? Like the, I think of like the American Happiness Project. It was a work of fiction, but it was about this fictional professor, who kind of caught on to the fact that everyone he would meet, when he would say, "How are you doing?" they would say, "Oh, I'm busy. I'm so busy. I'm doing this. I'm busy." And he basically started saying in response, like, he basically said, "I'm just going to say I'm not busy and see how people react." But that is culture, like people accepting that that is the way it's always been, and that's the best way, is culture. And I think, we're all dealing with, high levels of stress and lack of boundaries. That's something I am very much a work in progress, boundaries. When you look at people's answers to kind of surveys about mental health and work in general, in our modern world, especially, right? Inability to unplug or like get away, right? I know I'm getting emails and WhatsApp messages and, all different mediums, like, all the time, right? And you feel like you have to respond. And I think like this the email at the left is an actual email that an associate at my law firm sent to me that made me very sad, right? He like actually had an out of office that like during dinner time, he was unable to respond to emails. Meanwhile, on the right, and I know it's an exaggeration, but Europe's like, I'm gone for 2 months, and everyone just kind of accepts that. So I think that kind of goes to boundaries. But um, I think getting to kind of what organizations are doing, whether it's a law firm, whether it's an organization, I think that people are smart enough to understand that half measures and sort of performative measures, like, hey, here come to the 1 hour mental health thing, but not doing anything to change the underlying work environment, um, is kind of easy to sniff out, and something that actually people get, right? So I think companies really need to kind of not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. Now I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next few slides. They're kind of law firm specific, but I'll give you the slides afterwards if you're interested. But there are a lot of people saying like, well, why, like, why is the legal industry, and I think that includes IP licensing, why is it in this bad place? Why is it high on this list? And there's some big picture takeaways about kind of culture, and at least for law firms, like the billable hour. I think there are also, there's also a certain like, hey, is there a certain type of identity, that or traits that are emphasized as part of culture? And I think some of this, frankly, is not particular to law firms or lawyers. Some of it is just very Western thinking, about how we do business, that it's transactional and we beat people and it's adversarial. And I think what we're learning, if you see anything about sort of modern leadership, and it's not just me, but smart people like the Harvard Business, Review, and that, we're in a world where I think that, being more collaborative, and seeing, that there's a different way, is actually, viewed as kind of better business practice. And listen, I give presentations like this. There's always like the one guy where I talk about being mindfulness, and he's like, oh, I can't, I'm a litigator. And I'm like, well, me too. Like, I'm also a litigator. But we're not warriors. I have not served, like, unless you have, served in the armed forces before becoming a lawyer, like, you're not a warrior. Like, you're just a lawyer. And a lot of times, the way that we get to better places in business is by being more collaborative. And that doesn't mean that there's not a place for, tough negotiations and zealous advocacy and all that stuff. But I think that making these, pieces of our identity, like the hallmarks of being good at our jobs, is kind of part of our problem. And I think these can get like embedded in a work culture, very, very easily, depending on kind of leadership. So, I think some of you may have seen like that Paul Hastings memo or slide that leaked, in the past few months, where they're like, this is how to succeed at Paul Hastings. Like, you never ask questions, you're always on and available 24/7. And, it's a little scary to see some reaction to that, because some of it is like, this is great, that's the truth, we should acknowledge this. And I'm like, that's just not good business. And I think, folks are starting to realize it, from the client side. People are like, when you're always on, you make mistakes and people leave. And it's not actually good for creative thinking. So I think a lot of this, um, and and I call this thing lawyering while human. A lot of it is really about things that I think should come natural to people who are human beings. But I understand that it doesn't. Like, we're in a competitive business world. Sometimes we put ourselves last. Sometimes we do things that aren't really good things when you sort of take a step back as humans. And talking about this issue, for example, you know, there are certain things that should be very simple, for folks to get, right? whether you're a lawyer or whether you're in tech transfer or whether you're an innovator, an inventor, like ultimately what your business usefulness is, what you're selling, is we're selling our brains, right? That's why people are hiring us, and that's why people are relying on us, and that's why we're good at our jobs. So it really shouldn't be so controversial to be like, we want to create an environment where we're taking care of our brains. And the science, right? It's not just me, but the science shows that if you're on and available 24/7 and you're overworked and you're always, responding to the email 2 minutes after it was sent, and that's the expectation, like that doesn't align with creativity and brain health. I took a class last year. It's available for free on Coursera. It's the science of happiness. It's given by Yale. I forget the name of the professor right now, but she's amazing. And it is now the most popular course in the history of Yale. So like, haha to my dad, who was like, we should only teach physics and math and not the fluffy stuff. But that course actually goes through, there's a lot of like really compelling science behind doing it differently. And that doing it this way, in a way that's so embedded in our culture, is not only like bad for ourselves, but bad for business. So skip to the lawyer personality stuff. I wanted to get to this point because, the more I do this, like the well human part is the most important part. I think a lot of this cross applies to a lot of different fields. And I think that these are issues that are leadership issues. When you see, smart people like Adam Grant, um, talking about, well, why are people leaving, and why do people stay, and what's driving, this. It's cultures that aren't aligned with well-being, which is a leadership issue. The other point it's important to sort of make is that we put a lot of this on individuals, right? We're like, well, there are lots of techniques you should try. Like here, like you should go to the gym more, which you should, right? We like that's good for you. Maybe you should try yoga, right? Maybe you should meditate, right? Maybe you should try journaling or gratitude, and all these individual practices. First of all, I used to completely reject those. I was like, mindfulness isn't for me. I'm a multitasker. I've come around on a lot of those, and I do find those useful. But if we're putting all this on individuals without changing the organizational culture, then we're not going to get change. We're not going to get to a point where people are flourishing. And in fact, it actually increases the disconnect. I think it's kind of like blaming the victim in some way, like you're not doing yoga well enough if you're still stressed. Well, actually, like there are things we can change organizationally about our culture that will contribute more to that changing than me doing yoga. So I also want to frame this as a leadership issue, and that's for two reasons. One, first time I ever spoke about mental health at a law school, which is Seton Hall Law School in New Jersey, where I live. They called it Building Your Self-Care Backpack for Law Students. And they gave it on like a Thursday afternoon right before midterms. But 3 people came, no men. And I get it, because people are like, like I'm here to succeed. That's just something that's like a box checker. I don't have time for it. So actually talking about this stuff, I think, is a leadership issue, in a similar way to like talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thinking about how to actually implement that as an organization. It's a leadership issue. If you are going to lead any organization and help it grow, it's really critical that you be able to navigate these issues for yourself, for people on your team, right? You have to build an organization that's going to be resilient enough and have structures and policies and procedures to deal with inevitably like someone struggling, someone having clinical depression, someone going through a thing. So I think it really is a leadership issue. And so I think those are the two reasons. Like one, telling people it's a leadership issue gets people to come to your presentations, but more importantly, it is a leadership issue. And I think more and more people are seeing it. Not everybody. There are always going to be leaders and people in organizations that are like, oh, like this is just people being lazy, and the way I did it, when I was younger, was just to work hard around the clock, and that made me great at what I do. And so, you do have to deal with those folks who are like, oh, this is lazy, I don't get it. But in fact, I think the skill set that's required to navigate all this stuff really aligns with, a skill set about building really good, sustainable, innovative organizations. And it's, again, like, not surprising. Even Ariana Huffington agrees that it's when any of us are exhausted and depleted, we're not serving our clients or our organizations well, and so we should put effort into sort of not doing that. So what do we do? And I think you know it's also a life issue, right? Like, we can be tech transfer experts and lawyers and licensing folks and commercializers and inventors. We can do that. We can run successful and rewarding and profitable businesses, and we can also, like, be happy and enjoy our work and lead balanced, mentally healthy lives. I'm an optimist, but I believe that's possible. And I have to tell you that right now I spend, don't tell my bosses, oh no, this is recorded, but I feel like I spend like 60% of my time talking about mental health and well-being and doing stuff like this, and another 70% of my time being an IP lawyer. And I know that's 130%, and I'm probably spending more time than I've ever spent doing work things. And maybe that's not great, and maybe I have to get that more into balance. But by doing both, I'm actually really happy being a lawyer. I'm getting it. I'm doing things that I enjoy. I'm working in emerging technologies. I'm doing cool stuff with AI and metaverse and blockchain, and doing fun licensing stuff. And I have to tell you, like, a little over a year ago, I was in a place where I was like, oh no, this is my brain telling me that I'm not supposed to do this thing that I've done for 20 years, and it's the only thing I know how to do. Holy crap, what am I going to do? And I don't think it's a coincidence that talking about both of these things, mental health and being open about it, and that I'm actually happier doing my job. I thought about, before I wrote that article in American Lawyer and said, like, hey, I'm just going to be relentlessly public about this. And I was coming back from a medical leave, and I was like, I'm just going to tell everyone at work that that I was out on medical leave, which many people didn't even realize because it was during COVID. I thought about it, and my parents, like, people know people in that generation. They're like, you shouldn't share that, because people are going to not want to work with you. And I have to say that I think doing both has changed me in a really positive way. And I think it's all integrated with doing good work. So it's a business issue. Now, what about the people who are like this, kind of the old guard, who are resistant to change? I'm a cynic. I've been working in law firms long enough to understand that there is a bottom line, right? We're in a business here. So I think the business case is also important for people to know, understand, build data around. I wrote an article last year that was published with practical law company Thomson Reuters on the business case. There aren't too many people out there writing about that. Another is Professor Jared Reich down at University of Miami Law School. But putting this data together, it's actually pretty stark, because, first of all, on the positive side, we are, I says lawyers are, but I mean, all of us who are good at our jobs, we are creative problem solvers, right? That's what we do. And if we're not functioning optimally, we're not doing the best and highest quality work. And there are actually statistics on this from some of those fancy consulting companies that do like broad studies across industries that show that workplaces with high levels of mental well-being, shocker, are more productive, right? Increase in productivity by over 12%. which wasn't always so apparent to me, right? Especially when I came back off of leave, in a mindset where I was like, oh my God, I just missed months of work and billable hours. I kind of my immediate instinct was to undo all the good stuff. I was like, oh, I don't have time to go for the gym, and I don't have time to go to therapy because I've got all these hours to make up. And that actually, I had to stop myself and be like, actually, you're going to be more productive if you do have boundaries and you are taking care of yourself. And I found that to be really true. So the other thing is the negative side. The numbers on this are super compelling. So there are studies that show that unresolved and hidden mental health issues create huge costs, in terms, not only of, when things go wrong, right? Claims or liability claims, but also, people, um, spending a lot of time recruiting the best and brightest people, training them, and then if you have a culture where those people burn out and leave in a year and a half, those are huge costs around them. So I think that no matter how you come at it, it aligns with good business. Whether you're coming at it from someone with experience like me, where I come at it from a moral place, or whether you're coming at it from the sort of old school, like I'm just going to look at the bottom line. I think you can get there both ways. So I think that's important for organizations to keep in mind. Um, I have a few more thoughts on this issue. One is just to share this data. So this is the data that's put out nationally. Like 1 in 5 adults are diagnosed with a mental health disorder, and that's a lot, right? That's like 20% of people. But as I mentioned earlier, and I think people are focused on this now. Like this is an Accenture report. We can look at the 1 in 5, but I think a better way to look at it is kind of like everybody, because if we expand the view from looking at ourselves only to looking at people that we're connected with, right? Like our kids, our parents, our friends, like everyone is literally navigating something. So we're not just talking about the 1 in 5, we're really talking about the 9.9 and 10. And I think a lot of people in organizations also look at this bell curve. And I think people used to think about it as like, the one tail of the bell curve is like the clinically depressed or anxious people. You want to make sure that those people can get help in your organizations, right? And of course, so you have things like EAPs and programs, and on the other end of the bell curve is like those are the people that they're like, just give me the gym membership and the yoga and I'm perfectly good and God bless them. But what I'm really talking about is like the meaty middle of the bell curve, which is kind of all of us just riding through life. And so I think this is really an issue for everyone. I tried to use a fancy math bell curve slide just with this crowd to drive that home. Another couple things that I want to emphasize is, I why are we focusing on this? Also, just apart from the business reason, we spend a lot of time at work. There's this guy Sahil Bloom, who I saw on Twitter, did a series of graphs of like people you spend time with at different parts of your life. Really eye-opening, not always in a fun way. Like he has one of parents spending time with their kids, which at like the age of 23, and my kids are like 18 and 21, it falls off a cliff, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting close to that. But the one constant, if you look across all the data that he shared, is at whatever age you're at, you're spending a lot of time at work and a lot of time with the people you work with. And so, it's important just life-wise for that to be a positive thing. Because as anyone who's seen Severance, and even those who haven't, knows, like, there's only one of you. Like we talk about work-life balance, but the truth of the matter is it's just one integrated whole. And we bring our work stuff home, we bring our home stuff work. And so it's good to look at what that means. The other point I just wanted to emphasize is that positive mental health isn't just like the not having mentally ill health. Like the World Health Organization definition of well-being, which was adopted by the National Task Force on Attorney Well-being, is thriving. And thriving really means not just the absence of mental illness, but looking across these pillars, right? Like, and I think this also aligns with people like being happy and doing good, innovative work at organizations, right? Like when there's a social connection, when people are like feel like their work is having impact, when they're intellectually challenged, when there's a spirituality, meaning like I feel like I'm impacting the world in a way that's bigger than just me. So all of these, I think to look at this in like an integrated way is to look across all of these issues, and I can get more into that for anyone who wants more detail on that. So to me, like in the workplace, this is about leadership, education, and culture. And I think, the way forward, like, there are lots of ways forward, but, I think that one thing that's very powerful is that I've noticed that actually creates change is storytelling, and people relate to other people. And like I have a partner I work with who, like, he's and I feel he's an excellent leader. And he puts like, this is my therapy appointment in his schedule, and people can see it. And if someone's like, hey, can I schedule a meeting? He's like, no, I'm doing therapy then. And I think, for what it's worth, me sharing my story with people has opened up a lot of conversations with partners, with younger people who are like, well, now I can talk about this thing that I was uncomfortable talking about it. So I think a lot of it comes down to, human-centric leadership. And I think if you look at sort of consultant folks looking at leadership, like you see this type of lingo. But also like a lot of what I was talking about is creating a culture of psychological safety. And I think, some people will look askance and being like, oh, quote unquote, safe space, blah, blah, blah. That's this fluffy thing. But, when we talk about organizations, a lot of what we talk about is making it such that if someone is struggling, there's a way to, it's actually okay for them to say, hey, can I get some help here? I think about like when I started my career at Kirkland and Ellis, I'm pretty sure I had vacation time. I may have had like 2 or 3 weeks, but I didn't know or care because the culture was such that like I was not going to take vacation. So it didn't matter to me. So, we can have EAP programs and all sorts of programs, but if you have a culture where people don't feel comfortable, we're not going to get to where we need to get. The other thing that we're seeing is client-driven change, like other organizations realizing like, hey, if we're going to work with you, we want to make sure that you guys are have an environment where you're taking care of your mental health, because that's going to get us the best results. And there are some really interesting examples both in the US and abroad, of that happening. The other thing that I think is required is, I mentioned stress earlier, but like creating atmospheres where stress is reduced. And I think a lot of this is tough for people to hear, maybe in law firms, and I modulate how I talk about it when I talk about it with different people. But a friend of mine who works in education, he's a professor, shared recently, like, hey, when you guys are hiring new managers, instead of only looking at like their book of business or how many hours they bill, like we should also look at them as managers. Like, do they create stress? Like how, or do they do they create environments where people like love working for them and it creates less stress? So, looking at those sorts of things and compensating people and promoting people based on that, I think is one way to kind of, push forward change. And that's kind of, that's all encapsulated in this recalibrating our attitudes and norms and cultures. So I want to close with just a few things on individual practices. I think that whether it's young attorneys or old attorneys or people working at different points in their career, there are different stressors. I think when you're young, there's the like, I have to just take on all this work and I can't say no. I think when you're older, it's different stressors, right? It's like maybe clients or having to deal with politics, but wherever it is, like there are always two levels to this. And one is like individual skills and practices. And I want to just take a moment to talk about some of these like fluffy things. I know we have just a few minutes. So, but these things are really important. So one thing is like self-awareness. I think this chart, it's a lot of words on the page, but but actually like checking in with yourself and knowing where you're at, because it fluctuates on the day to day. Like I said, life is dynamic, and understanding like what I should do if I'm in, green, yellow, orange, or red. I think, having the competency to do that, um, like this was kind of new to me, and I do this now, and it's really powerful. And I think once we make it a practice to do for ourselves, we can also, expand that, to others at work. So this is kind of a handy chart. I stole it from a psychiatrist, who presented with me at a law school, but it's like, here's where I'm at. And then at the bottom, it's like, well, what should I do? And how do I navigate through that? I think it's really powerful. Um, I don't have time to really talk about individual tips and practices, but I will say that, I am not like a yoga meditation person, but I definitely have adopted like some mindfulness practice in my own life, um, in terms of, trying to set boundaries, trying to sort of focus on one thing, trying to take breaks. I may not meditate, but I'm like, I'm going to go outside with my dog, for this half hour and then come back in a different sort of mental state. I also talked about communication earlier, like as a young person, that like, and also me as a people pleaser, like it's a struggle for me to tell people like negative information, right? This bad thing happened, or oh, this bill was higher, or we didn't do that. And my tendency always was to just like suck that in and procrastinate, and trying to really be intentional about changing that and just getting it all out there, I think, has helped. So I'm happy to talk more about individual tips if anyone kind of, wants to do that. But, in the end, I think, my big takeaway is that this is not some fluffy side thing, and that, destigmatizing is great. But that just means we're talking about it. And so now we're getting to the point where we need to kind of do the leadership work of culture change, a lot of which is, being human and trying to sort of integrate human values into our everyday and into our organizations. So I will stop talking now because I'm pretty much at time. But I thank everyone. If anyone has questions or wants to talk about anything I said, happy to do that now. And I'm this is how to contact me, but I'm happy to share these slides like through Carolyn if anyone wants them.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions for Mike, if you want to raise your hand, we can promote you over to here and we can discuss. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.